A folding chair, a quiet street, a man in uniform carrying a gift for his daughter. No shouting, no sirens, just the gravel shifting under boots and the silence that always comes before things fall apart. This isn't just about a bullet or a badge or a man, it's about the space between dignity and danger, the breath held. The voice withheld the gaze that refuses to drop. He didn't fight back, he didn't beg, he stood still. And somehow that was enough to threaten everything, sometimes the loudest thing in the world is a man who refuses to be erased. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Because here, in this moment, we go back to where it began, where silence met power and history blinked it. Started like any other afternoon, Nathaniel. Briggs had driven that route slow, steady and silent, the hum of the old Ford pickup blending with the sigh of wind through the trees. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of a quiet upper-middle-class neighborhood where American flags fluttered beside seasonal wreaths and no one parked crooked on the curb. Nathaniel had just left the Veterans Memorial Cemetery, still in uniform, still carrying the weight of another eulogy, tucked behind, his ribs like a folded letter. Never meant to be mailed, he wore it all, the starched fatigue jacket. The shine of brass at his collar, the kind of calm only men who've walked away from war understand. The silence inside the truck wasn't empty, it was full of everything. He couldn't say out loud his daughter's house was just 6 blocks away. He'd promised to drop off the folding chair she forgot at last week's cookout, and maybe, if he wasn't too tired, he'd stay for dinner. You sure you don't want me to bring you something instead? She'd texted that morning, Nathaniel. Hadn't answered. He didn't know how to tell her that sitting down for a meal felt heavier than a 10-mi ruck march. These days, not because he didn't love her, but because lately he wasn't sure what kind of man she saw when she looked at him as he rounded the bend near Dogwood Drive. A police cruiser slid into his rearview mirror. No siren, no lights, just that slow, predatory pace he'd come to recognize over the years. At first, he didn't flinch. Cops patrolled this area often, especially during election season, but the cruiser didn't pass. It lingered, tightening its distance like a leash around his bumper. Nathaniel checked his speed, 27, the limit was 30. His plates were clean, his tags up to date still. He felt it, that old familiar prickle at the base of his neck. Like standing too close to a live wire, he signaled early for his turn, hoping it would wave the cruiser off. It didn't. It followed. Nathaniel's hands tightened on the wheel, thumbs flattening against the leather as the truck coasted to the stop sign. He didn't say a word, didn't curse, didn't ask why. He just breathed slow through his nose and watched the mirror. The cruiser's headlights flicked once then. The blue and red strobe lit the back window, painting the inside of the cab in flashing gilt. Damn. He whispered, not out of anger, but exhaustion, in the way you whisper when you realize. The day just got longer. He pulled over, eased the shifter into park, and turned off the engine. The hum of the street quieted to a strange stillness. No lawnmowers, no barking dogs, only the faint mechanical ticking of his engine cooling under the hood through the windshield. He could see nothing but the split-rail fence across the street and a plastic tricycle tipped in the yard. Everything was too still. Nathaniel reached slowly, deliberately for the side pocket of his cargo pants, pulling out his military ID and setting it on his left thigh, where he'd always kept it during checkpoints in the Middle East. With his right hand, he rolled down the window halfway. Then he placed both hands back on the wheel, thumbs visible, palms open, not because he felt guilty, but because he understood the rules. Just be polite, he muttered to himself. Be clear, be small. It was something he'd learned long before the uniform, before the Bronze Star. Before 20 years of service taught him that the battlefield didn't always end at the tarmac. He'd learned it on sidewalks as a teenager at job interviews. In bank lines, the lesson was simple. Being right doesn't always keep. Use safe footsteps approach, not fast, not aggressive, but loud enough to betray the weight of boots on pavement. Nathaniel kept his eyes forward, refusing to glance sideways. He listened instead. The air shifted. Someone exhaled sharply, then cleared their throat. License and registration. The voice was dry, middle-aged, tired. But not the kind of tired that came from shift work, the kind that came from years of resentment. Nathaniel didn't turn. He nodded once. Officer, I have my military ID right here. My driver's license is in the glove box. Would you like me to did? I asked for your resume. The words hit sharper than expected. not the volume, the intent. Nathaniel swallowed his. Fingers still unmoving. No, sir, he said quietly, just trying to be respectful. There was a pause, one of those dangerous pauses that aren't really silence, just the time it takes for someone to decide. Who you are, Nathaniel, finally turned slow and steady eyes meeting the man behind the voice. The officer was white, early 40s, stocky, with a badge that sat crooked on his chest and a smirk that didn't match the SHO situation. He didn't even look at the ID, he looked at Nathaniel's skin, his uniform. Then the truck, and something in him curled. Fancy jacket for someone driving a rust bucket. He muttered, "You sure that's real?" Nathaniel didn't blink. "Yes, sir. I've worn it for half my life." The officer leaned in slightly, his hand resting on the edge of his holster. "You live around here, Nathaniel?" Took a breath, not deep. "Just enough to speak. I'm headed to my daughter's place, 2 blocks over." The officer tilted his head as if studying an exhibit, then stepped back. "Stay in the vehicle." Nathaniel nodded once. "Yes, sir." As the officer circled to the rear of the truck, Nathaniel felt the weight shift inside his chest. Not fear, not yet, but the knowledge that something had cracked the shell of normal. The street was still quiet. The wind picked up, slightly rustling the flags, but the air now tasted different, like something just under boiling. Waiting, he looked at the military ID on his leg and thought of his father's words spoken long ago. "Before boot camp, your name means something. Don't let the world take that from you." Nathaniel straightened his back, fingers flexing once on the steering wheel, then going still again. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this. How a man held his breath could mean everything. The officer came back around the side of the truck, slower this time, not cautious, but deliberate, like a man walking into a room he thought he owned. Nathaniel could hear the subtle crunch of his boots on the gravel just beyond the curb, the soft metallic click of a thumb brushing the edge of a holster, a quiet rhythm that didn't match the supposed calm of this suburban street somewhere. Down the block, a sprinkler system ticked to life, sending a soft, rotating hiss into the air, a strange backdrop to the heavy silence that was gathering between them like fog. Nathaniel, he didn't move his hands, stayed on the wheel, his breath steady, though his chest had started to tighten, just slightly beneath the surface, like a thread being pulled inside him. "You didn't answer my question," the officer said, stopping just outside the open window, eyes scanning the truck's interior like he was expecting to find a hidden weapon or maybe a reason. Nathaniel looked at him, calm but alert. "Which question was that, sir? You live around here?" The officer's tone was flat now, but with something sharp curling under it, the kind of sharp that cuts without needing to raise its voice. "I told you my daughter lives 2 blocks over. I'm dropping off a chair. She left at the house." The officer's eyes didn't blink. They hovered for a moment over the back seat, then down to the floorboard, then back up to Nathaniel's chest. "You military?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the uniform. "Yes, sir. United States Army. 22 years. It wasn't a word, not really, more of a sound, a skeptical grunt that hung in the air just long enough to be insulting. "Looks new." Nathaniel gave a slight nod. "It's my dress uniform." "Today was a funeral, right?" The officer muttered, then leaned in a little closer, nostrils flaring. "You always wear that when driving around rich neighborhoods." Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He knew the trap wasn't in the question itself. It was in the implication that he didn't belong, that his presence needed justification beyond his name, his record, his very skin. "I wear it when I honor the dead," he said, "not for appearances." The officer straightened up but didn't move away. His hand rested now on his belt, thumb hooked near the holster. Elbows slightly flared. "Well, you sure look like you belong in Arlington, but this ain't Arlington." Nathaniel looked straight ahead, jaw tightening. The wind shifted again, pushing the scent of cut grass through the open window, carrying with it the faint dry rustle of leaves scraping concrete somewhere. A screen door creaked, then snapped shut. "I've got nothing to hide," Nathaniel said quietly. "You're welcome to run my name." "Oh, I plan to," the officer replied. "Just don't make any sudden moves." Nathaniel turned, his head slightly enough to meet the man's eyes, but not enough to challenge him. "My hands haven't left the wheel." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he walked back toward his cruiser, his movement slow but somehow charged, like he wasn't finished, like he was hoping for a reason to come back with more. Nathaniel exhaled slowly through his nose, shifting his gaze to the side mirror. The cruiser sat still, engine idling, lights still flashing a red-blue pulse against the rear view that made everything feel like an emergency even when no one was. Bleeding, he thought of texting his daughter just a quick note to say he might be late, but decided against it. One wrong movement even to reach for a phone could be mistaken. And that was the part that stuck with him, the need to calculate every motion like a chess piece in a game, where the other side got to rewrite the rules time. Passed differently in moments like these, it stretched and folded the minutes feeling. It's thick like honey slowing through a funnel. He could hear the faint murmur of the officer's radio now, a voice crackling in and out. Unclear but urgent, a child's laughter floated through the air for a brief second, cutting across the tension like a thin ribbon high and out of place. Nathaniel glanced to his right across the street. A young boy had stopped riding his scooter, frozen on the sidewalk, clutching the handlebars with wide, uncertain eyes. Behind him, an older woman peeked through her lace curtains, the phone already to her ear. Nathaniel met her gaze for a fraction of a second, then looked away. The door of the cruiser swung open with a metallic groan, and the officer stepped out again. This time faster, more agitated, as if something inside him had started ticking louder. His hand was on the grip of his sidearm, now resting but not drawn, and that was what chilled Nathaniel most, not the action, but the assumption that one could move from suspicion to threat without a single provocation. I said, "Step out of the vehicle." The officer barked louder, now voice cutting through the Suburban. Hushed like a cracking glass. Nathaniel didn't move, sir. I haven't done anything wrong. Step out of the truck. The officer's tone turned, clipped, each word loaded. Nathaniel's fingers twitched slightly, then went still. He knew how this could go, knew how quickly calm turned into chaos when fear and authority collided in the wrong hands. "I'm not resisting," he said, voice even low, "but I'd like to understand the reason for this." "Stop. You don't get to ask questions." The officer snapped, his hand twitched on the holster. Nathaniel slowly reached for the door handle, not because he felt safe, but because he felt cornered, and sometimes compliance was the only shield left too. A man who had already surrendered everything but his dignity. His heart beat slow and steady, but his skin prickled cold under the collar. As he stepped out, the sun hit him full across the chest, igniting the gold trim of his insignia like a flare. He stood tall, back straight, legs set, not out of defiance, but from training, a quiet message etched into posture. "I am not your enemy. I am not your threat. I am not the story you've already written in your head." And still the gun didn't move from its place. The air between them was no longer just air. It had thickened into something else, something dense and unspoken, like the moment before a fuse catches flame. Nathaniel stood outside the truck with his hands by his sides, palms open, shoulders level, eyes steady and locked just over the officer's shoulder. He didn't speak, he didn't breathe heavily, he simply held still, the way a man does when he knows one wrong breath might be mistaken for defiance. The sun had shifted behind a thin layer of clouds, softening the golden edge of afternoon into a pale, watchful gray, casting longer shadows across the pavement, which now felt less like a road and more like a stage across the street. The woman behind the curtain had vanished, but the child remained frozen near his scooter, holding his golden coot retriever by the collar, as if something in his small body understood that stillness was safer than sound. Nathaniel didn't look at the boy directly, but he knew he was being watched. That was the thing about moments like these. Even silence had witnesses, and sometimes they were the ones who remembered most clearly. "Turn around," the officer said again, voice clipped louder than before, as if needing to reassert dominance over a situation that hadn't slipped from his hands, but had refused to collapse the way he'd planned. Nathaniel didn't move immediately. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to speak the words low and careful. "Sir, I am unarmed. I followed every instruction." "Is there a reason you're escalating this?" I said, "Turn around." The officer barked, and now the gun was no longer just near his side. It was drawn, arm extended, barrel pointed squarely at Nathaniel's chest. There was a moment, just a flicker of one, where the wind died down completely and the world became a vacuum. No birds, no leaves, no distant hum of air conditioners or passing cars. Just the quiet tension of two men locked in place, one holding a weapon, the other holding stillness like a shield. Nathaniel's eyes met the officer's, and he saw it then, not rage, not even hatred, but something smaller and more dangerous insecurity weaponized by authority. "I'm asking you again," Nathaniel said, his voice barely above a whisper, but so clear it cut through the space between them like a line drawn in glass. "What is the threat you see?" The officer's jaw clenched, his knuckles widened. Around the grip he didn't answer. Instead he stepped in closer, less than 10 feet now, and his voice dropped into a growl. "You don't get to question me, not here, not dressed like that, not driving that truck in this neighborhood." Nathaniel understood in that moment that no answer would satisfy the man, not because there wasn't one, but because the question itself wasn't real. It was a performance, a stage. Set not for truth, but for justification. "I'm a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army," Nathaniel said, the words as steady as his breathing, "and I've done nothing wrong." The officer flinched. Just barely then, without warning, no gesture, no countdown, he pulled the trigger. The sound was sharp, dry, and intimate, not like in movies, where gunshots echo with cinematic drama, but more like the sudden snap of a tree branch breaking under pressure. A sound you only truly understand when it happens in your direction. Nathaniel felt the impact before he registered the noise, a blinding sting. Shot through his left shoulder, searing into the muscle just above the collarbone like someone had pressed. A hot nail through bone. He didn't scream, he didn't fall, he staggered a step, knees bending slightly, hand moving instinctively toward the wound before he caught himself and froze because he knew, even now, especially now, that any sudden movement could be read as aggression. Instead, he drew in a shallow breath, winced as the air scraped past his throat, and stood upright again. The officer blinked. He had expected something different, maybe chaos, maybe a charge, maybe the kind of reaction he could point to later as proof, but all he got was silence and a man staring back at him with pain in his eyes. "But no fear," Nathaniel spoke again, voice barely audible. "You shot me for what?" The officer didn't answer. His gun hand dropped half an inch, the tremble beginning in his elbow before it traveled to his wrist. His face wasn't triumphant or regretful, it was blank. Like a man who'd just broken something and realized too late that he couldn't fix it. From a second-story window came the soft, unmistakable click of a phone camera, then another, and then like a ripple moving through still water, the neighborhood came alive. Phones lifted behind fences, behind hedges, and parked cars and front yards, and the street had turned into a stage, and the audience had arrived with record buttons already pressed. Nathaniel's knees finally buckled slightly, and he lowered himself to the ground, not as surrender, but as control. Choosing the moment before it was chosen for him, he sat down carefully, leaning back against the truck's front wheel, his right hand pressing lightly against the fresh wound, blood soaking slowly into the olive-green fabric of his uniform. "Call an ambulance," said louder now, not pleading, commanding. "That's your job. Do your job." The officer didn't move. "Call it," Nathaniel said again, blood now tracing a line down his forearm, a thick living red. "Or someone else will," a woman's voice called from across the street. "We've already called. They're on their way." Then quieter, but caught clearly by someone's phone. "He didn't do anything. I saw it all." Nathaniel leaned, his head back, eyes closing for a second, letting the pain ride at the edge of his breath, but not take it from him. Somewhere distantly he could hear sirens, now faint but growing louder, like the sound of judgment arriving in stages. He opened his eyes again and saw the officer standing over him, still holding the weapon, but no longer in control, not of the moment, not of the story, not of himself. "Thought I wouldn't survive this," Nathaniel murmured almost to himself, but he had. And now the world was watching. By the time the ambulance arrived, the air had already changed. The street, once silent and still, now buzzed with an unnatural hum, not from sirens or engines, but from attention. Neighbors had stepped out onto porches, not speaking, just watching their faces, a mix of fear, confusion, and something else.
No one wanted to name.
Phones hovered in the air like tiny spotlights, each one recording not just a moment, but a version of the truth, each angle capturing a different frame of the same unspoken question. "How did we get here again?" Nathaniel sat slouched against the tire, his back stiff from trying to remain upright, his uniform stained in a growing arc of blood that darkened as it dried. He was alert, though the pain had begun to crawl deeper under the skin, settling like heat along his spine. His eyes stayed open, blinking slowly, watching the edge of the sky shift above the rooftops. As paramedics knelt beside him, and began their assessments. "Where's the shooter?" one of them asked. Voice clipped but calm as he checked Nathaniel's pulse, still unseen. Someone replied, though no one pointed toward the officer who now stood frozen. 10 feet away, his weapon holstered, hands trembling slightly at his sides, Nathaniel turned his head just enough to glance at the paramedic. "Don't worry," said voice, but steady. "He didn't hit anything vital," the paramedic didn't respond with. Words just nodded once and pressed gauze firmly to the wound, his eyes flicking briefly toward the gathering crowd before returning to the task across the street. A man in a faded polo shirt whispered to his wife, "Did you see that uniform? He's military?" She nodded, eyes wide, and reached for his hand. No one in the crowd yelled or protested. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that they were watching the shape of something break in front of them, and no one knew how to catch it before it shattered entirely. Within an hour, the first video surfaced online. It was raw, shaky, filmed vertically from a second-floor bedroom window in the frame. Nathaniel's body could be seen upright, calm, the officer, shouting, gun drawn. Then the crack of the shot and the quiet afterward. No special effects, no music, no commentary. Just a man in uniform being gunned down for not moving fast enough, not being small enough, not disappearing quickly enough. By nightfall, the clip had reached 2 million views by midnight. It was on every platform: Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, accompanied by hashtags like "Number shot the uniform" and "Number justice for Briggs." People began sharing their own stories, their own encounters, their own moments of stillness where they had wondered if the next second might be their last. Mothers wrote of teaching their sons how to speak when pulled over. Veterans posted photos of themselves in uniform, beside captions that read, "Would this have protected me?" News anchors spoke with tight voices and careful tone. Today, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a decorated military officer was shot during a routine traffic stop. One reporter began, her eyes flickering to something off screen, before continuing, "Unarmed, in uniform, on his way to visit family." Cable news debated everything except the obvious. They debated training, they debated procedures, they debated whether the officer had felt threatened. What they did not debate was the look in Nathaniel's eyes, captured clearly in frame still, and focused, as if he knew the bullet was coming long before it arrived in the hospital. Nathaniel lay under dim lights, his shoulder freshly stitched, the four humming beside him like a background score to a life. Suddenly paused. The pain medication dulled his thoughts, but didn't erase them. His mind replayed the moment. Not the shot itself, but the breath before it, the stillness, the certainty. He remembered thinking, "If I move, I die. If I don't move, I might still die, but at least they'll know I stood still." He turned his head slightly and saw his daughter Maya sitting by the window with her knees pulled to her chest, phone in her lap, eyes unreadable. "You okay?" he asked, voice barely audible. She looked over, tried to smile, then shook her head. "There, talking about you," like they didn't see the video. She said, "Like, maybe you moved too fast. Like, maybe." It was a misunderstanding. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He stared at the ceiling, tracing the slow arc of the fan. Blades overhead. "People don't need truth," he finally said. "They need something they can live with." Maya stood, walked over, and took his hand. "I don't want them to live with it," she said. "I want them to choke on it." He smiled faintly, not because it was funny, but because it was true. "Me too," he said, "but that's not how these things work." The door opened, and a nurse stepped in, quiet and professional. "There's a statement coming from the Pentagon," she said softly. "There, acknowledging your service. There's talk of an investigation." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, acknowledging. He repeated, as if tasting the word, "That's a start," but he didn't believe it, not yet, because acknowledgement was easy. It was action that cost something. It was accountability that hurt outside the world. Continued spinning on the news. His name flashed beneath grainy stills of his face. Lieutenant Colonel Nathaniel Briggs, age 48.
Oh.
Bronze Star recipient, survivor. The anchors said it like a title, like a brand. But Nathaniel knew better. He wasn't a symbol. He was a man who had bled quietly on the pavement while the country argued over the cost of truth in the early morning hours as the city slept, and the screens glowed faintly in living rooms across the nation. The clip played again and again, frame by frame, second by second, until what was once a moment became a reckoning, and for those who watched closely, who didn't blink or scroll past, the question became impossible to ignore. If even he wasn't safe, whoever will be the following morning before the sun had warmed the hospital. Window panes. The Pentagon issued its first official statement, brief, vague, and sterile, like it had been translated. Too many times, through too many cautious hands, we are aware of the incident involving Lieutenant Colonel Nathaniel Briggs and are cooperating with law enforcement in an ongoing investigation. That was all it said. A single sentence dressed up in formality, offering neither condemnation nor clarity, just enough distance to claim acknowledgement without assuming responsibility. Nathaniel read the headline on his hospital room television in silence. The volume muted the ticker at the bottom scrolling. Passed like it was talking about someone else, he didn't speak for several minutes. He just stared at the screen, the glow of it reflecting off his IV bag and the corner of his tray table. His shoulder ached under the bandage. Ack! A low, persistent throb that pulsed in time with his heartbeat, but the pain wasn't. What bothered him most? It was the weight of that one sentence. Statement, how it managed to say so little and yet carry the unmistakable chill of a wall being built, a wall of protocol, a wall of plausible deniability. He could almost feel the machinery turning behind it. Quiet, efficient, bloodless Maya stood. Near the window, arms folded, her voice low but taut. That's it. That's all they're going to say. Nathaniel didn't turn his head. Just exhaled slowly through his nose. It's how institutions speak. They don't say what they mean. They say what won't. Get them soothed. She stepped closer, her jaw-tight eyes burning with frustration. You bled on the street in uniform. They're supposed to protect you. He looked at her, then really looked. No, baby. They're supposed to protect what I represent and write. Now I represent a problem they can't explain away outside. The day had fully broken, though the light remained soft and gray as if even the weather hadn't quite decided whether to commit to sun or rain. Reporters had gathered near the hospitals. Rear entrance cameras perched on tripods, their questions prepared like weapons. But no one had been allowed inside. The official line was that Nathaniel needed rest, but the unofficial truth was simpler. They weren't ready to deal with what he might say inside the Department of Defense. However, silence was wearing thin behind closed doors. The conversation was no longer whether the shooting had occurred. The footage had settled that the question now was about timing, about exposure, about who knew what and when. A colonel in internal operations had flagged a document, an unreleased risk report filed 3 months earlier by Nathaniel himself, detailing systemic racial disparities in interagency patrol assignments it hadn't made. Waves then. It hadn't even been read by anyone beyond the first review layer, but now it sat like a live wire beneath the surface of every meeting, threatening to connect dots. No one wanted visible. Nathaniel hadn't mentioned the report since the shooting, not to the doctors, not to Maya, not even to his commanding officer, who had visited briefly the night before, face taut with concern and something colder underneath self-preservation. But the file existed, and some people had started asking questions quietly, of course carefully, but asking all the same. Later that day, a man in a pressed civilian suit showed up at the hospital, credentials in hand, smile tight and eyes unreadable. He introduced himself as a liaison from the Office of Military Public Affairs, here to assist with the messaging around your experience. The phrasing made Maya stiffen immediately. Nathaniel, ever composed, simply nodded toward the visitor chair. You're here to help shape the story, he said plainly. Not accusing, just naming the room. The liaison gave a non-committal shrug. We just want to make sure things don't spiral in a way that causes further harm to you, to the institution. Nathaniel let that hang in the air a moment before answering. You mean the kind of harm that comes when the truth gets too loud? The man didn't blink, didn't flinch. I mean the kind of harm that makes people stop trusting the system, which frankly we can't afford right now. Nathaniel leaned back against the pillow, the pain in his shoulder flaring slightly with the motion. He smiled, but it was small and tired, a smile used by men who've seen just enough to know when they're not being asked. They're being handled. Trust was lost before I ever got shot. I'm just the first one people saw bleed. The room went quiet, then the kind of quiet that doesn't settle but waits. The liaison stood, buttoned his coat, and nodded politely. We'll be in touch, he said, and walked out without another word that night. Maya found her father reading through an old leather folder he'd kept locked in a weatherproof Bag beneath the floor panel of his truck, the one the officers hadn't searched inside, were printed emails. Incident logs, and one envelope marked submitted. Unprocessed. She sat beside him and asked softly, "Is this what they're afraid of?" Nathaniel closed the folder gently and met her eyes. "Not the report," he said. "The fact that someone who looks like me dared to write it." In the hallway outside, nurses walked. Past like shadows, soft-footed and professional, carrying trays and charts heads down the world, kept moving quiet as always, but inside that hospital room. Something else had begun, not anger, not revenge, but the quiet click of gears turning toward. Reckoning Nathaniel didn't sleep much that night. He watched the ceiling. Fans spin slow circles above him, and for the first time since the shooting, he allowed himself to think forward, not about survival, not even about justice, but about memory, who would carry it, who would bury it, and what it might cost to make it stay visible long enough for someone to care. It was just after 2 o'clock in the morning when Nathaniel woke up the third time that night, not from pain, not from the four beeping beside him, but from something colder and deeper, the kind of alertness that came not from the body, but from memory. The room was dim, cast in pale yellow light from the corridor outside, and everything was still too still. He lay there for a while, listening to the faint mechanical hum of the vitals monitor and the distant roll of a gurney wheel echoing faintly through the quiet wing, but something inside him said the silence was not just quiet, it was watching. He turned slowly toward the tray table and saw the leather folder again, the one he had half packed away before sleep claimed him hours earlier. It sat there now like a sealed warning, as if opening it again might summon something irreversible. But what else was left? The damage had already been done. The lie had already taken root. All that remained now was whether the truth would survive long enough to be believed. He sat up with a wee see, the stitches in his shoulder tugging sharply against. The movement then reached for the folder and opened it. The first page was a printed email, the one he'd sent 3 months before, to internal compliance, with the subject line observed. Patterns in patrol assignment bias. He remembered writing it late at night after 3 weeks of compiling incident logs from joint operations, noting how officers of color were more often assigned to risk zones, while others coasted through lighter details without question. He hadn't accused anyone he hadn't named. Names, he just followed the data, and maybe that was the real crime, not speaking up, but doing so with evidence. He flipped through the rest slowly, carefully, until he reached the envelope at the back. The one marked submitted unprocessed. It was the original printed form he had dropped off by hand, placed in the locked intake box outside the policy office at Fort Vinton. He remembered pressing the seal down with his thumb, standing for a long moment in the hallway before walking away. He had believed then foolishly that the system still had ears. Maya stirred on the couch near the window, blinking slowly, adjusting her sweater as she sat up. Her voice was still wrapped in sleep. "Dad, what time is it?" He didn't look up. "Late," he said quietly. "Or early, depends on how you measure these things." She rose slowly, rubbing her eyes, and walked over. "Can't sleep." He handed her the envelope. "This was supposed to go up the chain 3 months ago. I followed every procedure, logged every pattern, did everything by the book, and it never moved." Maya studied the label on the envelope, her eyes narrowing. "They buried it." "No," Nathaniel said. "They didn't even bother to bury it. They froze it, locked it in a drawer, so it never even got a chance to be denied." She looked at him then, not like a daughter, but like a woman, trying to understand the world her father had always shielded her from. "Is this why they targeted you?" Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "I didn't think it would matter. I thought, if I just stayed in my lane, kept my voice measured, wore the damn uniform with pride, they'd at least hear me out, and instead they pulled the trigger." She said the words landing heavier than she expected. He nodded slowly. "The moment they saw me, they didn't see a report writer. They saw a threat." The door to the room creaked slightly, then opened, not with the usual nurse's knock or cartwheel shuffle, but a quieter entry. A man in civilian clothes stepped inside, tall, gray-haired, his face unreadable, no ID badge, no clipboard, just a sealed envelope in hand, and the kind of posture that said he wasn't here to check vitals. Nathaniel sat upright instinctively. "I didn't mean to startle you," the man said, his voice low, precise. "I just got off shift. Thought you might want to see something before morning." He stepped forward and handed Nathaniel the envelope. The seal had already been broken. "What is this?" Nathaniel asked, his fingers brushing the edge. "A copy of the report you filed." "The man," replied the one that never reached Homeland Security. "I pulled it from the internal cache before my credentials got revoked." Maya stepped closer, tension sharp in her shoulders. "And who are you exactly?" The man looked at her briefly, then back to Nathaniel. "I was in policy oversight until I asked. Why your submission had no tracking number after that, I was reassigned temporarily to Alaska." Nathaniel opened the envelope and slid the pages out. They were his own words. His own charts stamped with a date and a timestamp, but no routing number. No case file. No sign that it had ever moved beyond intake. "You tried to move it." Nathaniel said. "I did more than try," the man answered. "But this system has locks you don't see until you try the wrong key." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "If you're planning to speak out, do it now, before they slam the lid. Shut this moment won't last." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded too much like finality. Nathaniel sat still, the papers in his lap, his daughter's hand on his arm. The room felt smaller, suddenly like the walls had drawn closer. Listening in, but inside him something had shifted. Not rage, not even fear, but clarity. The bullet hadn't been the beginning, it had been the end of someone else's decision, a decision made the moment he stepped out of line. Not by shouting, but by documenting. Maya sat beside him, eyes on the folder. "What do you want to do now?" Nathaniel stared forward, voice barely above a whisper. "I want to speak, and I want them to listen, not because I shouted, but because I never raised my voice until I had to in that moment, with the city asleep and the corridor empty." The man they'd tried to erase made a quiet decision to be remembered. It was nearly dawn when the nurse found the object sitting neatly on Nathaniel's bedside table. Small gray paper bag, unbranded, unsealed, placed with such care that it looked almost ceremonial. She paused, hand on the edge of the doorframe, narrowing her eyes as if expecting it to disappear the moment she stepped into the room. Nathaniel was asleep, his breathing deep but restless, one arm slung lightly over his midsection, the IV line looping gently from the pole to the crook of his elbow. The bag hadn't been there. During the night check, she was certain of that. She approached quietly, her rubber-soled shoes barely making a sound on the polished floor, and reached for the bag with tentative fingers. But something about it made her hesitate, not because it looked dangerous. It didn't. It looked ordinary, but the kind of ordinary that drew attention to itself by being too perfect, too placed. She didn't open it. She simply left it where it was, made a note in her log, and moved on. It was the sound of the door clicking shut that stirred Nathaniel awake, his eyes fluttering open to the gentle hush of morning silence and the faint mechanical pulse of the vitals. Monitor beside him, he blinked once, twice, then noticed the bag. His body stiffened instinctively. Not in fear, but in trained assessment. Something had changed in the room, and he needed to know.
What?
He sat up slowly, every movement still drawing a deep ache from his stitched shoulder, and reached for the bag. The paper crinkled softly in his hands, and the weight inside shifted just enough to reveal something solid. He opened it, not quickly, but with the deliberation of someone who'd learned long ago to never rush toward. The unknown inside was a stainless steel military thermos, the kind issued years ago to recruits during advanced training. Practical, utilitarian, unmistakable. Peeling label on the lid read Bravo 17 Corps 2019. Nathaniel froze. That unit hadn't been on his file for years. Most people barely remembered it existed, but he did. He'd led the psychological evaluation team for that entire deployment rotation. He unscrewed the lid with care, tilting it just slightly to peer inside. There, wrapped in a small Ziploc bag, was a matte black USB drive. No markings, no tag, just a plain piece of plastic and metal, the kind that could be purchased anywhere. And yet in that moment, it felt like holding a grenade. Disguised as a key, Nathaniel stared at it for a long time, then reached for his laptop, the personal one untouched by the hospital network kept. Intentionally offline, shielded from intrusion, his fingers hovered over the keyboard before inserting the drive. The screen blinked once a folder appeared titled Secure Copy, Archive 5. He clicked it open, and what unfolded before him wasn't just data, it was memory proof and resurrection. Dozens of files reports minutes from briefings audit tables. Even flagged communication logs populated the screen like ghosts returning to testify it. Was his archive the very contents he thought had been lost the night of the shooting, when the USB drive he'd hidden in the glove compartment never appeared? In the police's evidence report, he opened one of the reports, his breath catching as familiar lines filled the screen, his own voice. Recorded in writing, outlining systemic discrepancies in patrol behavior, inter-unit communication breakdowns, racial, trend analysis, disciplinary avoidance patterns. This wasn't just a backup. It was a complete mirror of what had gone missing. Maya stepped into the room. Hair still tangled from sleep, holding a coffee she'd clearly forgotten to drink, she saw. The look on his face, the way he stared at the screen, was something between disbelief and reverence. "Dad, what is that?" He turned the screen toward her without saying a word. She leaned in her eyes, scanning the documents, fingers tightening around. "The paper cup is this. Everything you collected?" she asked. He nodded. "Everything, and someone kept it. Someone who wasn't supposed to." She glanced at the thermos. Who would have even had this? He looked down at the peeling label again. One name came back to him, a quiet, serious young recruit named Lee. Asian American, soft-spoken, always sat at the back during roll calls. Nathaniel had once stepped in to shield him from a biased superior, who marked him as culturally unfit for advancement. That moment hadn't seemed like much back then, just another quiet decision to protect someone who didn't have the rank to protect themselves. But maybe it had meant everything. He turned back to the computer, clicking into a hidden subfolder labeled "Message Pending" inside. A single TX file opened with just a few lines. "You probably don't remember me, but I remember you. You didn't let them erase me, so I didn't let them erase this. I can't be seen, but I won't let you fight alone." Nathaniel sat back in the hospital bed, a breath escaping his chest. That he hadn't realized he was holding. He wasn't the only one still carrying the weight. Someone out there, unnamed, unseen, had chosen not to forget. He closed the laptop slowly and looked out the window as the first golden edge of sunrise broke through the clouds, touching the buildings across the city with soft light. It was the kind of morning that made everything look fragile and sacred, like the world was still deciding whether to begin again or fold under its own weight. Maya sat beside him, not speaking. She didn't need to. They both understood what this meant. The story wasn't just about a gun or a wound. It was about memory, what survived, who preserved it, and why. Nathaniel reached for the thermos and placed it back on the table with a quiet finality. "They thought they wiped it clean," he said softly, "but memory has teeth. It always comes back when you least expect it, and outside somewhere in a city still." Waking up, a silent ally walked unknown among the crowd, carrying the truth like a candle hidden in his chest, waiting for the moment someone else would need the light the next afternoon. Nathaniel sat alone in his hospital room with the curtains drawn halfway, letting in a soft filtered light that made everything feel slightly slowed, like time itself was hesitating outside. The window, the sky was pale blue, the kind of quiet color that felt neither promising nor bleak, just undecided. The screen of his laptop glowed steadily, the cursor blinking at the edge of the last folder he had opened. It was labeled blue. Line Network 7Z, a name that meant nothing at first glance, but everything once you understood what it carried. He had spent the last 2 hours going through the files one by one, not skimming, not searching for a single smoking gun, but absorbing the full weight of what had been hidden. Each document was a thread, and as he followed them, they wove into something bigger, something denser, a map not of accidents but of design. At first, it had just seemed like a pattern of bad actors, the occasional abusive officers slipping through the cracks. But this was a system, a network. It didn't scream corruption in bold headlines. It whispered it in memos, transfer approvals, performance reviews, with just enough coded language to pass inspection. He opened a personnel chart next to spreadsheet tracking the movement of certain officers across departments and jurisdictions. Over the last 7 years, several names were highlighted. One of them was Raymond Keller, the man who had shot him. The file showed Keller's failed psychological evaluation in 2016, his disciplinary warning in 2018, and a quiet reassignment to civilian policing in 2019, facilitated by a recommendation from someone flagged as part of this internal circle. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, the edge of the hospital pillow digging into his shoulder blade, but he didn't shift. His eyes stayed on the screen. This wasn't just about Keller anymore. It was about the doors that opened for men like him, the blind eyes The protected ranks, the unspoken rule, as long as you protect the uniform will protect you. He clicked into a subfolder titled Internal Escalation 2020, where a summary report showed the number of substantiated complaints. Against certain units, all resolved administratively, most involving officers later promoted. The language was so neutral it felt surgical. No further action warranted. Disposition resolved via interagency review, transferred to alternate jurisdiction. He whispered to no one they didn't fix anything. They just moved it around until no one could follow the trail. There was a knock on the door, 3 soft raps, deliberate but not loud. Maya stepped in carrying 2 cups of tea and a folded newspaper tucked under her arm. Her expression was cautious, like she'd been watching the world too long without. Blinking, she set 1 cup on the table beside him and handed over the paper. The headline read, Pentagon receives civilian whistleblower report alleging systemic cover-ups in law enforcement. They're not naming you yet, she said, but they're definitely circling the story. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Good, let them circle. Eventually they'll realize there's no way out but through. Maya sat beside him and watched the screen. What's that folder? He hesitated, then turned it toward her. This is the infrastructure behind everything they call an exception. This is where policy meets protection, not of the public, but of themselves. She scrolled through the files in silence. After a while, she said quietly, So what happens now? Nathaniel's voice was soft but firm now. We stop pretending it's just a few bad apples now. We show the whole orchard is being managed to rot. He opened a document labeled Blue Line Talking Points Final and read aloud one of the internal directives officers listed as core loyalty to be retained under discretionary review, regardless of field performance metrics. Recommendation, avoid assignment conflict with names tagged as Jackson, Cantu, or Boone. He looked up, something dark and steady in his eyes. They had my name on a watch list. Maya, not for threats, for visibility. She stared at him, stunned. They were tracking you as a risk, because you told the truth. He nodded. They always do, not because the truth is dangerous, but because once it's named, it can't be forgotten. Outside, a distant helicopter passed overhead, its blades thumping rhythmically, fading quickly into the horizon inside. The silence returned, not heavy, not hopeless, but tight, like something winding itself. Up before release, Maya's voice cut through. Gently, we have to get this to the right people somewhere. It can't be buried again. Nathaniel reached over, opened a final document. Marked confidential. Calm, and read a line near the bottom. Keep them in Blue's loyalty. Secured, he exhaled slowly, rubbing his hand over his face. That's their shield. They hide behind the idea that the uniform redeems. The man. Maya picked up the thermos, ran her thumb over the peeling label. But you wore it for the opposite reason. He looked at her, something fragile and fierce passing between them. Yeah. I wore it because I thought it meant something. She reached for the USB. Careful, but unafraid. It's still combative. We make it. He gave her a small nod, not the kind that promises victory, but the kind that accepts the cost. That evening, as the hospital settled into its quiet rhythm, hallway lights dimmed, carts pushed softly from room to room, nurses speaking in hushes. Nathaniel sat with the laptop open, cursor blinking again at the edge of a story that someone once tried to erase. He wasn't angry anymore, wasn't afraid. He was ready, because now he didn't just have the truth, he had the receipts. And the world was finally listening. The landline rang at 2:37 a.m., slicing through the silence like a blade. 3 short rings, no more, no less, and then it stopped. Eliza Briggs stirred on the living room sofa, her head tilted toward the flickering television screen, the remote still loosely clutched in her hand. The room was dark, save for the green glow of the microwave clock blinking 2:37 in the faint streetlight. Bleeding through the drapes, she hadn't used the landline in years, not since Nathaniel went full active duty and they'd agreed cell phones were safer, simpler, easier to carry when things went bad. But tonight, someone had called it, someone who didn't want to trace. She sat up slowly, her body tense before her mind. Caught up the phone, didn't ring again. There was no voicemail, no red blinking light, just stillness, cold and absolute. She didn't need to check the caller ID. She didn't need to hear the voice again. It had been dry, male, and razor flat, the kind of voice that didn't issue warnings, it delivered consequences. Don't Let him testify again, or your daughter will be next. The words replayed in her head, not like an echo, but like a presence in the room, something left behind in the cushions, or pressed into the walls. She stood up carefully, walked to the kitchen counter, and picked up her cell phone with both hands. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she typed 2 words. They know she hit send. The message marked read in less than a minute. She didn't type anything else. Eliza didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there barefoot on the tile, clutching the phone, staring into the dark, like she was trying to calculate the cost of a decision she hadn't made yet upstairs. Mariah was asleep, or had been the daughter they had promised would grow. Up far from all this, far from the corridors of secrecy and the language of threats, when Nathaniel called her back, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I saw your message." He said, "I don't need you to do anything, Eliza," replied her tone calm. "But carved from something steel hard, I just need you not to back down." There was silence on the other end. Not hesitation, but heaviness then. Nathaniel exhaled, slow and steady. "If I turn back now," he said, "I'll carry that failure for the rest of my life. And still won't protect anyone." They didn't say more. No assurances. No comfort. Just 2 people who had been through too many deployments, too. Many coded reports had now found themselves in a war with no map, no rules, no defined enemy at sunrise. Eliza drove straight to Mariah's campus. She waited outside the lecture hall, watching the students spill out in clusters, backpacks, slung earbuds, and faces bright with the kind of naive belief that the world would eventually play fair. When Mariah finally spotted her, she blinked in surprise, then smiled. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Elisa didn't explain. She hugged her daughter tightly, the kind of hug that transferred something more than warmth from now on. She said, "Don't go anywhere alone, and if anything happens, call me. Not the police." Mariah pulled back, slightly confused. "What's going on?" Eliza's voice was steady. "Just trust me, please." Mariah didn't press. She looked at her mother's eyes and understood some truths. Arrive without being said, and some warnings. Don't come with reasons. That evening, back in the hospital, Nathaniel sat near the window with the USB drive in his hand, his reflection faint in the glass. He hadn't told Eliza about the new threat. He didn't have to. She already knew the system had shown its hand, not in court filings or televised debates, but in the middle of the night, through an unlisted call and a voice that sounded like it had already decided what grief would look like on a mother's face. Valerie, his attorney, arrived just after 6 o'clock, a folder tucked under her arm and a thin sheen of exhaustion on her face. "I've requested a full federal protection detail," she said, not sitting, but they're stalling, saying there's no confirmed threat. Nathaniel didn't look at her, of course. They're stalling. They'd rather protect the system than the people who expose it. Valerie walked to the window and stood beside him. "You don't have to do the second hearing. You've already made your point. The files speak for themselves." He shook his head. "No, they don't. They whisper. People will." "Ignore whispers unless you make them loud," she sighed, running her hand over her brow. "And if making them loud puts your daughter in danger." Nathaniel turned, his gaze heavy but clear. "Then they've already won if I let fear write the end of this. Become everything I've spent a lifetime trying not to be invisible." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Outside, a bird landed on the windowsill, paused, then flew off again. The city below moved like it always had, people commuting, doors opening, someone stopping for coffee without knowing. How fragile peace really was that night. Eliza unplugged the landline. She placed it in a drawer without ceremony and locked it, not because it was over, but because some instruments of fear don't deserve a second chance to speak. Nathaniel stared at a photo on the table. The 3 of them from a camping trip last summer, all wind and sun and smiles. He picked it up, held it like something sacred, and whispered, "They can scare me, but they don't own the story." Then he opened his laptop, checked the files again, and began preparing for the hearing. It's not because it was safe, but because truth rarely is. It was nearly midnight when Nathaniel left the hospital without telling anyone, not the nurses, not Valerie, not even Maya. He moved quietly, dressed in plain clothes and a surplus military jacket that didn't draw attention, his shoulders still wrapped under 2 layers of gauze. He didn't carry a phone, only a folded paper map and the kind of silence that made him invisible in a city where people had long stopped looking at one another. He walked 4 blocks before hailing a cab, gave the driver an intersection with no hesitation and rode the rest of the way without saying a word outside the window. The city blurred past glass buildings, late-night diners, streetlights, blinking red and gold, each one fading into the next like a memory. He no longer trusted. He arrived at a private lot behind a federal holding building where Officer Raymond would. Keller was temporarily housed pending trial. The structure was nothing special: concrete walls, steel doors, and a single guard booth staffed by men who didn't wear name tags. Nathaniel waited in the shadows behind a support pillar, leaning against the cold concrete, listening to the soft hiss of the underground ventilation system and the occasional high-pitched hum of a security camera turning in slow mechanical rhythm. He didn't have clearance to be there, but that didn't matter. Some things didn't require permission. Some confrontations were written in silence long before the words. Ever caught up? He stood there until the elevator dinged open with a flat metallic chime, and Keller stepped out wearing a hooded sweatshirt and a baseball cap pulled low, carrying a white paper bag like someone retrieving cheap takeout. He didn't look surprised when he saw Nathaniel. He didn't flinch. He just stopped walking and gave a crooked smile, the kind you'd wear when seeing an old friend who never forgot what you did. "I knew you'd come," Keller said, his voice calm and casual as though they were meeting for coffee. Nathaniel stepped out from the pillar, the motion slow but grounded, and looked him in the eye. "You knew a lot of things," he said, "but you didn't know when to stop." Keller shrugged, glancing briefly at the nearby camera. "You think I planned it? You think it was personal?" Nathaniel didn't blink. "Wasn't it?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that only comes between men who both remember too much. "You remind me of someone," Keller said, his gaze narrowing. "That look in your eyes, same one my training sergeant had, same tone. Like you were better than everyone else in the room." Nathaniel stepped closer, his boots silent on the concrete. "You pulled a trigger. You almost ended a life. You don't get to rewrite the motive just because you can't stomach the consequence." Keller's smirk faded. "I didn't shoot you because you're black," he said, but his voice was thinner now, stretched like a wire pulled too tight. "I shot you because you looked at me like I didn't belong." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "Isn't that what you said to me?" Keller's hands tightened around the paper bag, corners crinkling under the pressure. "You don't understand what it's like, always being the one passed over, the one no one trusts with command. You get it all handed to you, medals, titles, salutes, and I'm still treated like a rookie who can't keep his hands steady." Nathaniel's voice was low, but steady. "You were passed over because you cracked under pressure, because you didn't listen, because you saw correction as humiliation." Keller took a step forward. "Number, because I was being measured against men like you, perfect, polished, righteous. You think this system works because of people like you, but it works in spite of people like you." Nathaniel didn't respond right away. He looked past Keller toward the corridor behind him where the light flickered, near a security panel. Then he turned back, his gaze heavy. "It works because we keep believing it can, until someone like you reminds us what happens when that belief becomes a threat." Keller exhaled long and slow. "So what now? Are you going to give another speech? Another file dump? You think that'll fix anything?" Nathaniel's eyes didn't waver. "Number, but it'll make sure no one forgets. I'll let you pull the trigger." Keller dropped the paper bag to the floor. The sound echoed sharply, but neither man looked down. "You think this was about one bullet?" Keller asked. "You think they care? They built this system for people like me. They just didn't think I'd go too far." "And you did?" Nathaniel said, his tone flat. "You went so far they had to act, not because of me, but because you exposed how far they'd let it go." Keller shook his head, not in denial, but in a tired sort of clarity. "You're not fighting me, Briggs. You're fighting the thing we both served. You're just pretending it was ever yours to begin with." Nathaniel didn't argue. He knew the truth. The system didn't need permission to protect itself. It only needed silence. And Keller had counted on that silence. To do what no order could ever condone, but what Keller hadn't counted on, what none of them had, was survival. "I lived," Nathaniel said simply. "And that means everything you buried is coming back to the surface." There was nothing left to say after that. Keller turned and walked toward the end of the corridor without another word, his shoulders hunched, the weight of everything he tried to justify. Now sitting squarely on his back, Nathaniel watched him go, then turned and left in the opposite direction, stepping back into the cold air of the parking lot where the city hummed softly in the distance and the wind moved like a whisper through the steel rails. He didn't need a victory, he needed a record, and now there would be no forgetting. It was still dark outside when Nathaniel adjusted his tie in the mirror, the fabric trembling slightly in his hands. Though not from nerves, not exactly. It was the kind of tremble that came from holding too much for too long, like a dam flexing against. A silent surge not ready to break, but never quite still either. His shoulder arced beneath the pressed layers of his blazer, stitched tight beneath the bandage, but the pain had become something familiar now. Not an enemy, not a warning, but a memory. Stitched into muscle, a reminder of why he had to walk through those courtroom doors with his head high. The hallway outside his hotel suite was quiet, the carpet thick beneath, his shoes muffling each step like it wanted him to turn back. Maya walked beside him, heels sharp, against tile, holding a folder in one hand and a small, trembling coffee in the other. She didn't speak much that morning. She didn't have to. Her silence was not fear, but focus, the kind that came from watching your father decide in real time to become something more than a victim of circumstance. When they reached the bottom lobby, a black SUV was already waiting. Tinted windows, silent engine, a federal escort in the driver's seat who didn't introduce himself. He simply opened the rear door, nodded once, and began the drive toward the federal courthouse. Nathaniel watched the city pass by in blue. Dawn light buildings glinting like worn silver, their windows catching the last trace of street lamp glow. This wasn't just a hearing, it was testimony not only of facts, but of what it meant to still believe in truth after watching it get dragged into the dirt and left for dead. The courthouse was already alive with murmurs. When they arrived, media vans lined the curb, reporters, strained by barricades and quietly ushered back, lifted their cameras as Nathaniel stepped out, his face calm, his suit pressed, his gaze straight ahead. He didn't wave, he didn't flinch, he simply walked, each footfall deliberate, as though the ground itself might shift if he hesitated. Inside, the chamber was colder than expected, not in temperature, but in tone-polished wood. White walls overhead, lighting too bright for comfort, casting everyone in pale realism. The judge presiding was a woman in her 60s, sharpied and still-fist, her robe flowing gently as she sat, like a figure carved from cold oak. Opposite Nathaniel sat Keller's attorneys, their postures stiff, their folders thick with questions that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with deflection. When they called Nathaniel's name, the room shifted. The shuffle of papers, the subtle clearing of throats, the long pause before he stepped forward. He swore in with his left hand raised, his right one resting on a Bible that smelled faintly of dust and old paper. The kind of sacred object you don't hold unless you mean to carry something heavier than yourself. He sat, adjusted the mic, and looked straight ahead, not at the defense, not even at the judge, but slightly above them at the silent clock on the back wall, ticking away in even unforgiving rhythm. What happened that day? The prosecutor asked, her voice steady, respectful. Nathaniel didn't rush. He spoke slowly, not for effect, but for truth. I was delivering a chair to my daughter, a small thing. Something ordinary. That's what makes it hurt, that it started ordinary. He told them everything from the stop, to the questions, to the gun being drawn, to the single moment where time split clean down the middle between who he had been and who the country had forced him to become. His words didn't rise. They didn't crack. They carried weight, not through volume, but through the quiet precision of someone who had nothing left to protect but the story itself. The defense attorney stood. Only once a tall man with tired eyes and a thin smile. Colonel Briggs said, "Would you say your posture, your tone, your presence could have been interpreted as non-compliant?" Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "If dignity feels like defiance to you," he said, "that's not a me problem." There was a moment of silence after that. Not tense, not dramatic, but deep, like the room had swallowed a breath it couldn't release.
Oh.
The judge said nothing, but her eyes shifted just barely enough to let Nathaniel know she had heard him, even if she couldn't yet say what it meant. Maya sat in the back, hands folded tightly in her lap, a single tear drying along her cheek. Eliza was beside her, gaze unwavering, like someone who had waited a lifetime to see truth walk into the room and refused to bow when Nathaniel stepped down from the stand. The room didn't erupt. There was no applause, no dramatic gasp, just silence. But it wasn't the same kind of silence that had greeted him months ago, bleeding against the tire of his truck. This was a different silence, one that listened, one that waited, one that, for the first time, made space outside the courthouse. The wind picked up, rustling the flags overhead, sending a faint rustle through the hedges along the front lawn. As he stepped into the daylight, reporters shouted questions, flashes clicked, and somewhere a microphone was shoved forward with urgency. But Nathaniel didn't stop. Maya caught up to him, said softly, "You did it." "No," he replied. "Not stopping." "I said it. That's not the same thing." She nodded. She understood, saying the truth didn't fix the world, but it put a crack in the foundation deep enough for light to get in. They kept walking past cameras, past questions, past the boundaries that were meant to keep men like him quiet, and behind them in that federal courtroom, lined with wood and doubt, the echo of a single voice, refusing to disappear, hung in the air like something sacred. The morning after the verdict, the sky was overcast. Not storming, not breaking, just a soft blanket of gray that made the world feel quiet and unfinished. Nathaniel stood at the edge of the Veterans Cemetery, a folded note in one hand, a single white carnation in the other, the grass damp beneath his shoes from the night's slow drizzle. Rows of identical headstones, stretched in every direction, solemn and precise, like soldiers still holding formation long after the war had ended. He took a breath that felt too large for his chest, then exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something that had been waiting far too long to leave the wind. Moved gently through the trees, catching the edges of his coat, the rustle, sounding almost like whispering, not words, but the memory of them, the kind that linger even when the speaker is gone. He walked between the graves until he reached one near the back, marked simply SGT Thomas Briggs, 1946, 1970. His father, a man he'd barely known, but whose silence had followed him like a shadow all his life. Nathaniel crouched, slowly placing the carnation at the base of the stone, the petals trembling slightly in the breeze. "I said what?" "I had to say," he murmured. "I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my voice. And I didn't lie." He sat there for a while, not speaking. Again, just letting the silence settle around him. It was different here. It was quieter than any courtroom, any press conference, any hearing room where justice had to be translated into procedure here. There was no need for evidence, no need for proof. Just presence. Back in the city, news headlines continued to ripple out war-decorated Army officers' testimony sparks. Federal review of law enforcement oversight, whistleblower files confirm years of suppressed complaints. Justice Department investigates interagency blue line practices. The media cycle had seized it all, repackaged it for daytime panels and late night monologues. Some called him a hero, some called him a liability, but Nathaniel didn't read the stories anymore. He didn't need them to shape the truth. He had lived it, he had bled it, and he had spoken it into rooms that were never meant to hear a voice like his. Later that afternoon, Maya found him in the garden behind his apartment, trimming the dead leaves from a row of potted basil plants. She didn't announce herself. She just stood for a moment and watched the way his hands moved, slowly, carefully, like he was afraid to damage something that had survived the winter. "You still cook with those?" she asked finally. Stepping forward, Nathaniel looked up the corner of his mouth, tugging into a soft smile. "Only when I want to remember who I was before all this." She sat beside him, brushing soil from the wooden bench, the sun finally beginning to break through the clouds in quiet shafts of light. "They want you to speak at the memorial next month for veterans who've testified under threat." He didn't answer. Right away he leaned back, hands resting on his knees, eyes half closed as if listening for something beneath the breeze. Then quietly, "I'm tired of being the warning." Maya nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "Then be the promise," the words landed with more weight than she realized. He looked at her not just as a father, but as a man who had carried the full measure of silence and decided it wasn't worth the price. Any more that evening, they lit a fire in the old brick pit he'd built years ago, when the world still felt smaller as the flames climbed and cracked. Eliza joined them with 2 blankets and a thermos of hot cider. They didn't talk about the trial. They didn't talk about Keller. They didn't talk about the possibility of change or whether it would come fast enough. They just sat there, 3 people who had walked through fire and still found something worth warming their hands beside after a while. Eliza looked over and asked, "Do you think they'll ever see you as More than what happened? Nathaniel stared into the flames for a long moment. I don't need them to. I just need them to remember what they saw. Later that night, in the privacy of his study, Nathaniel placed the USB drive into a small wooden box alongside the medal they gave him after. I racked the first photo of Maya at boot camp graduation and the leather-bound journal his father had left. Behind pages mostly empty, except for a single line on the first say, "What needs saying even if it shakes the room?" He locked the box and slid it back onto the shelf. The next morning he walked into a community center not far from the courthouse. Greeted by a group of students preparing for their first civics round, a teacher handed him a marker and pointed to a whiteboard. "Would you mind opening the session?" she asked. Nathaniel took the marker slowly, then turned to the room with the students. Looked up expectant, unsure, curious. He smiled not because he had all the answers, but because he finally understood the question. He wrote one word across the board in large, steady letters, dignity. Then he turned and said, "This isn't about one case, or one cop, or even one country. It's about deciding every day that no one gets to decide your worth for you." And in that room, no cameras, no headlines, no court records, his voice carried. Further than it ever had, because what started with a silence and a shot had ended with something louder. Something clear. A story not just survived, but told in the telling. Finally was enough what happened to Lieutenant Colonel Nathaniel. Briggs was not just a tragedy, it was a revelation of what's still fierce beneath the surface of uniforms and institutions that claim to serve justice. Through silence, memory, and quiet defiance, Nathaniel exposed not just one man with a gun, but an entire system built to protect its own shadows. He taught us that dignity isn't granted by the badge you wear or the rank you hold. It's something you carry quietly, even when the world demands you drop it. This story wasn't about revenge, it was about remembrance, about the cost of speaking the truth when it's inconvenient and the courage it takes to do so, even when no one's clapping. Nathaniel stood not to be seen as a hero, but to ensure that no one like him would be silenced again for trying to be human with honor. And in the end, it wasn't the courtroom or the media that mattered. It was the people who listened, the next generation watching. And the legacy that now has a voice because he chose not to disappear if this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you that silence is never neutral. We invite you to like, share, and subscribe. Help us spread these voices, these truths, these lessons, because the world doesn't change from noise alone. It changes when we choose to listen, and when we make sure others hear what must never be forgotten.